Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and tonight I'm going to be taking you through some miniatures by giants of the game. I'm not talking physical height, I am talking reputation in chess history. And my three players that I really want to highlight tonight, and if we have time, maybe we'll get to a special fourth, are the three players that happen to be missing from a certain top 50 players list that Chess24 is working on. For those of you unfamiliar, they are going through a video series highlighting the 50 best chess players in their opinion, and they have yet to announce the top three. However, I have some guesses as to who they may be. So our first miniature tonight is actually going to come from the same tournament that I covered last week, and that is the 1963-64 US Championship. Now, I didn't get a chance to look at this game during that lecture because there were just so many excellent games to look at, but I want to highlight it here. Of course, this is the US Championship where Bobby Fischer went undefeated, 11-0, a perfect score, and he had his fair share of brilliancies throughout that event. So in this round, he was up against Robert Steinmeier, and he chose, of course, 1e4. As he always said, best by test. Steinmeier chose the Caro-Kann. We get d4, d5, and Bobby chooses the classical variation with knight c3. These days, of course, e5 is the more popular move at the top level, and really at the amateur level as well. This is how players with the white pieces have been trying to put a little bit of pressure on black's position, but knight c3, of course, is a perfectly fine way of playing. This leads to d takes e4. Black doesn't really want to further defend this pawn with something like e6, and if you go something like knight f6, then of course e5 is going to kick the knight away. Of course, why not e6? Well, the point of the opening is to develop the bishop, and e6 locks that bishop in. But okay, that's enough of that. D takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop f5. Again, the point of the opening in the Caro-Kann is to get this bishop outside the pawn chain. Knight g3, bishop back to g6. And now, of course, those of you familiar with this position will know it's just all very much mainline theory here. Bobby chose knight f3 first, highlighting this e5 square right off the bat. Robert Steinmeier just plays the move knight f6, and then we get the main h4 move by white in this variation. And this is sort of the crux of white's play in this classical Caro-Kann variation. Black gets the bishop outside the pawn chain, but he has to spend now a second tempo on the bishop, and after h4, it actually demands a third tempo from the bishop. How so? Well, white, of course, is making a threat. If black tries to develop, then h5 is going to essentially trap this bishop. Bishop f5 takes is, of course, a pretty terrible pawn structure for black, with this king stuck in the center of the board. So, of course, here, h6 is what was chosen by Robert Steinmeier, giving this bishop a flight square. And now, normally in this opening, you would actually see white go after this bishop once again. Since black hasn't guarded e5, this could be done with bringing this knight to e5, or even playing h5, just to kick this bishop around one more time. Instead of that, though, Bobby Fischer leaves this pawn on h4 and goes bishop d3, immediately allowing black to trade off these bishops. So, who has a guess as to why Bobby chose to leave this pawn on h4 and to leave this knight on the f3 square? I'm asking you, chat room, what do you think the idea is of leaving these two pieces where they stand for the moment, rather than bring them further into the action with h5 or knight e5? See what you guys can come up with here as my chat actually fails to load. We'll try again. To stop g5, says Chess King, and that's not quite the right idea. It's not necessarily that we are stopping this move by black, but it is very much about the g5 square in the case of this h-pawn. Bobby has a very particular idea in mind, and that is to control g5. Maybe even later you could envision a g-pawn push by white if black were to castle kingside, but this extra little bit of dark square control we're going to see is going to come in very handy for white. As to the reason why Bobby left this knight on f3, your guess is as good as mine, but I think one good reason is that after knight d7, black would be immediately offering some trades, and it would make white's play a little bit more forcing, as well as black's play. And instead, we see Bobby leaving these pieces where they are, and perhaps giving himself a little bit more freedom in the opening. We see e6 by black now, just getting ready to develop. Bishop d2 is the main move by white. Notably, this bishop would be great on f4, but it runs into actually some slight awkwardness on this diagonal. It's not so comfortable for white to leave this queen on a5, because white very much would like to queenside castle, and this queen would not allow it. So that's why you see the awkward square of bishop d2, rather than the active square on f4. Black now finishes development with knight b to d7. We see queenside castles, and queen c7. So we are 11 moves into the game, and of course, I am claiming that this is a miniature, and it's a little bit unclear how black is destined to lose this game in just a few more moves. So what Bobby does here is actually a very, very deeply conceived trap. What he starts with is just a perfectly natural move in the Caro. Bobby goes c4. The point of this move, of course, is to just gain control of the d5 square, hint at a d5 break a little bit later on, and try to suppress these black knights, keep them under wraps here without too many squares. We see black queenside castle, and then already on this exact move, move 13, seemingly there's not too much going on just yet, but Bobby lays a very, very sneaky trap that Robert Steinmeier falls for, sort of hook, line, and sinker here. So what does Bobby do? Well, he plays a perfectly good, developing, improving move. And that's what the best traps do at this top level. You know, they play seemingly an innocent, improving move, but then the tactics that justify that move are sort of lurking behind the scenes. Now, in today's matches, most of the time, those tactics never surface because both players sort of understand what's going on. But in this particular game, it ended so quickly because Steinmeier perhaps underestimated Bobby Fischer's idea here. So what does Bobby do? He plays the simple move bishop c3. Now, why does white want to play bishop c3? Well, it's, pretty obvious. This is going to be a good diagonal. White wants to open it up, and it defends his pawn, supports a knight coming to e5 later on. Just a good, developing, improving move. Now, if black plays accurately here, probably the best thing to do is just simply develop this bishop, and then the game is just going to continue. It's nothing too crazy, probably knight e4 by white, stepping out of this. And like I said, the game is going to continue on from here, probably c5 by black, d5 by white, coming in the near future, and it'll be a chess game, right? No huge mistakes by either side. But Steinmeier in the game perhaps suspected that bishop e3 might be a little bit too loose to get away with. What does every move in chess do? Well, it comes with drawbacks, right? This is something Maurice Ashley loves to say. Aikido chess, every move has a drawback. What's the drawback to bishop c3? Well, you used to be defending all these lovely squares along this diagonal, and you no longer have that sort of defensive coverage. So black goes queen f4 check. And at first glance, this is not really doing anything too crazy. It just checks the king. Bobby just plays king b1, very innocently, just moving the king out of check. And then black plays the move knight to c5. And all of a sudden, things start to look a little bit tough for white, at least optically. This knight is coming into the game, going to be attacking some weaknesses over here on the king's side of the board, and white may find himself in a lot of trouble. Bobby again just retreats the queen. Of course, you cannot capture this knight due to the pin on the d file, so queen c2, and black's idea was to bring this knight out to e4. And, at first glance, everything is going according to plan. What's the big deal here? Black has occupied the center with the knights. f2 is horrendously weak. Knight takes g3 is also going to be a big threat in the position. And black seems to be doing great, if not for this idea by Bobby Fischer. So chat, I want to turn it to you again. What was Bobby Fischer's idea? What was his conception here that allows him to win this game in glorious fashion. In glorious fashion. And yeah, Chess King is hitting on the right idea here, and that is that this queen is running a bit low on squares. And perhaps the reason this pawn was left on h4 is Bobby knew he wanted to reroute this bishop to this diagonal, in some cases a little bit later on, and now this pawn is doing some of the work that this bishop used to do on this c1 h6 diagonal. In fact, it's helping to hamper this queen a little bit. So what could be the idea? And yeah, the chat is coming up with a pretty good candidate move, which is knight e5. But is knight e5 working? Is it correct? What does black have after knight e5? This is an equally important question to ask. First of all, what is our idea with knight e5? We're attacking this, but is that enough? And then secondly, what does black have in response? Chess King says knight takes g3, then queen f5. I'm not so sure that is actually getting the job done, right? Knight takes f7 would be coming at the end of that line, and your rooks would be forked. Let's go ahead and put knight e5 on the board, just to help out here. We're threatening to trap the queen. How are we threatening to trap the queen? That's a bold claim there, FX, that we're threatening to trap the queen. Show me the way. Anish says d5 and opening the c file. I assume he might mean c5, but it's a bit slow, right? This is a pretty big threat here. This is a pretty big threat. Does knight e2 trap the queen? To my eyes, it looks like queen f5 is available to the queen. d5, then rook d4. You guys are playing a lot of moves at once, right? Whenever you move, this is a big secret in chess, then your opponent gets to move. It's a disaster, honestly. Bishop d2. Is this the idea? I think knight takes d2 remains legal. Yes, so unfortunately, this trap was so deeply conceived by Bobby Fischer way back when he played bishop c3. I'm fairly certain he saw this coming when he played bishop c3. And the chat, and honestly myself, if you ask me this question, would have a hard time coming up with the exact idea right away. So the main point for white, it is in fact just this f7 pawn. It's an incredibly difficult pawn to try to defend here, right? If you go knight d6, at the very least we have this move c5, the knight moves again, and we're going to be able to take this and win the game quite convincingly, right? You can't give up f7 and these two rooks, which, by the way, this is why I really don't like these queenside castles variations in the Caro-Kann. Quite often, f7 just ends up being a horrible, horrible weakness. So our threat is knight f7. It's a difficult threat to stop, but the reason why this trap is so cool is that seemingly black has active counterplay, right? You know, who cares about f7? Because black is able to take on f2, right? This is the key move that black has available. And now queen takes g3 seems pretty impossible to stop, right? If you take on f7, what's going on if you take on f7? Well, I think, yeah, simply something like knight takes d1 or knight takes h1 or queen takes g3, any of those moves after knight f7. And it looks like black is still very much in the game. So what was the idea about knight f2? How does white win in this position? Rook hf1, well, that's not really the end of the story, right? Rook hf1, this piece is currently hanging. I could take it if I so desired. should take free pieces when you can. There's also moves like knight g4 to consider. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot going on here. So, chat room, what's the win? What is the win? So Chess King is giving me a technically winning variation, but where is, you know, your sense of whatever you call it, your sense of art? So of course the better move besides Rook HF1, the line that Chess King gave, by the way, is very good for white, I believe. Queen G3, Queen F2 is what he was giving. Here, Knight E4 is playable though, that you have to look out for. And yes, white is winning if you do this or if you do this. It's just very good for white. But it's not nearly winning enough. Do better. Do better than this line. Diver says Rook F1. Yes, but which rook and why? Knight E2, Queen F5, G4. I could trade the queens. Come on, my friends. Come on, I could take this as well. All right, I believe in the chat room. I believe that you guys can get this one. So Chess King says, or Rook D to F1. Okay, so if you guys haven't found the solution just yet, I would encourage you guys to pause at home. I don't want to spend all lecture on this position. But the idea is, in fact, Rook D to F1 with the really, really cool point that after Queen takes G3, we don't take this piece with the Queen when we get this Knight E4 line, which is pretty good for white. Maybe even winning, but not, you know, stunning, not a stunning miniature. Instead, we get Rook takes F2, and now what's the point? Well, you start looking around the board, you look at all these squares, your Rook on H1, by the way, not the Rook on D1, covers this pawn. You look at these squares, you look at this square, you look at that square, you look at this square and this square, and you start to say, huh, looks like that queen is still trapped. Even without the knight on G3, we are trapping this queen, and it's simply impossible to stop. You can go Queen E3, but now Rook E1, Queen G3, Rook F3. That queen is in the trap. Nowhere to go. Even from E3, all the squares are covered. All the squares are covered. And that would be the match. So that's the idea. Rook F2, and this queen is actually incredibly, it is trapped. No way out for this queen. What about this move, Knight G4? Well, this is a bit more boring. White can just capture this knight on G4. There's a pin on the F file, and then take this with the queen and be up a free piece. Again, totally winning for white with the extra piece. So Rook D to F1 was the insane trap, but this only gets more impressive the deeper back you go. You can say, okay, you know, clearly black is a moron. Who would ever play knight C to E4 here? You know, obviously Bobby had this knight E5 move in mind. Why not just retreat and then call it a day? Well, the fact is, with this move knight C5, black had already fallen for the trap. There's no turning back at this point. After Queen C2, this knight is attacked. You must do something with it, and if you think you're going to retreat, knight E5 again comes in full force, and this knight takes F7 idea is almost impossible to stop. The only way is with knight takes E5, and then after this idea, let's say knight G4, it turns out black is going to have all the same problems. Takes, Rook D1 check, King C8, Rook D4, and again, this queen finds itself completely stuck. Queen F2 the only move, and again, white is just winning a piece absolutely for free. So this deep conception by Bobby with Bishop C3, he knew all along that knight C5 was a losing move, and black just fell right into his plan. So what seemingly, at first glance, you know, I did sort of explain along the way, but when you first look at this game, at least when I first look at this game, I was like, why is this game so impressive? Black just got his queen stuck on the king's side, that, you know, nothing really doing here. Like, why would this be a memorable game by Bobby Fischer? But then the deeper you look, you start to realize that it's all in this bishop c3 move, right? Bobby knew knight c5 was going to be losing, and black just didn't understand why. So questions on this game? Questions on what's going on here? FX says it was probably preparation. I don't know. It's 1963. They don't really have these supercomputers doing all their prep for them, and we're reasonably deep into the game. Like, this isn't a common position by any stretch of the imagination. In the database I'm using, since like 1970, this has occurred something like 8 times. Definitely not super mainline theory here, I think. So maybe Bobby prepped it, but it is still impressive nonetheless. So, queen f4 check, knight c5, and black is busted. By the way, if you play knight c5 without queen f4, then it just really doesn't make any sense, because this knight can't even come here, and you would just have to retreat. That's why queen f4 happened before this knight e4 idea. All right, let's move on to our next giant of the game, winning in miniature fashion, and we, of course, are going to talk about the one, the only Magnus Carlsen. And he was up against Anish Giri, actually, in a Grand Chess Tour event. So we like those. And this was back in Zagreb, Croatia, I believe. I don't remember the year, but we'll figure it out. And Anish Giri had white. Now, my timeline on all the Twitter banter is a bit fuzzy, so I don't know if this was in the midst of, you know, Anish Giri and Magnus Carlsen's big trash talk back and forth that they do all the time. But I'm sure looking back, Magnus has some fond memories of this game. So Anish had white here, and the game starts again with 1e4, and Magnus started with the Sicilian. We get knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. This Rossolimo stuff is what it's all the rage with those top players. Magnus goes e6, going for control of the d5 square, and Anish just captures on c6 unprovoked. Now, after b takes c6, sort of the character of the game that we're going to look at is white is aiming to play against this bishop a little bit, playing for some extra central space, whereas black is going to have a nice central presence as well, with these two c-pawns providing some support of these squares. Anish plays the move d3, again looking to shut down some of these diagonals a little bit. Magnus continues with knight e7, just getting developed. Knight f6 can sometimes run into an e5 move, and while that would be okay, e7 is just a good square for the knight as well. You also don't want to get pinned in some cases. So knight e7, looking for these sorts of squares. We get h4 by Anish Giri, and while this isn't like a novelty, this very much is a sideline. It's not the most common move, and it is going to be a little bit suspect. So on its surface, h4 seems like a good move. You're just sort of preemptively launching your kingside attack. Notably, this knight on e7 isn't really coming to f5 or d5, so it's looking like it's going to come to g6. And so h4 sort of plays directly against this idea, with the idea of h5 to sort of boot this knight out of the way at any moment. So Magnus responds in kind with h5, making that idea highly illegal for Anish, and preparing to bring this knight here anyways. So why did Anish go for this? Well, it's going to be a little bit of a battle between whose h-pawn is actually weaker here. Magnus is going to be looking to prove that the h4 pawn is the biggest weakness, whereas Anish is going to be applying some pressure to this h5 pawn himself. And in addition to that, white makes one other huge gain with this trade-off, and that is the g5 square. Black is no longer able to play a move like h6 to evict a white piece from g5, and that's a pretty massive gain for white. With this dark squared thinking in mind, Anish continues with the move e5, looking to take over some of these squares, but Magnus is having none of it and plays d6 to get these squares back rather quickly. E takes d6 is played, and now we do still see knight g6 by the world champion. This was always the square for the knight, and it now makes even more sense with this little bit of pressure on the h4 pawn. It's a race to get developed now. Anish plays the slightly strange looking knight f to d2. What's the point? Well, the point is this knight is going to be better served coming to one of these squares, attacking d6, and controlling the center than it was on f3. And again, it's a question of h4 versus h5. Now, Geary is offering up this h-pawn to Magnus with the caveat that after it gets captured, look out for a move that kicks this knight out of the way, when after knight f5, white is going to be recapturing here on the h5 pawn, and probably is going to have the more active pieces if this queen gets brought into play. So knight fd2, a strange looking move, and perhaps not the greatest move in the position. I think better for Anish would have been a normal developing move, activating these queenside pieces, but knight fd2 is an interesting idea as well. Magnus continues normally with bishop takes d6, we get knight to c4, and now Magnus has to make a decision. This diagonal or this diagonal. So bishop e7 or bishop c7. Chat room, what do you think? Which diagonal makes more sense for the bishop here? And I'm being told that YouTube is down for a large portion of the planet, which is awkward because we're streaming to YouTube. So here I think definitely the square to go to for Magnus is going to be the e7 square. Why is that? Well, once again, it's going to be about Magnus trying to apply a little bit of pressure to this h4 pawn. Now, if you go to a square like c7, I'm not saying this is the worst move of all time, but you're not really going to be putting much pressure on anything on this diagonal. You want to look to pressure the h4 pawn. So I like e7 a bit better, and that's where Magnus chooses to go. It's all about early on in openings like these. I think both players were sort of out of book reasonably early, and it's just about making sure your pieces make sense with each other. If you go bishop c7, then this knight and this bishop are sort of playing two different games, as well as this queen. The queen and knight are focusing on h4, this bishop is focusing on this other diagonal, and together it doesn't make that much sense. So bishop e7 keeps all the pieces working together, and that's why I like this move. Geary continues very naturally with the move knight c3, looking for some e4 squares perhaps. And now Magnus has to figure out what to do with this bishop. Thankfully, it's not the hardest decision of all time. One option is to actually go e5 with the idea of bringing the bishop out this way, but I like what Magnus did in the game, which is bishop a6, and just trading off this bishop for this knight on c4. We see queen f3 by Anish Geary, and now it's decision time for Magnus. You had an idea. Your idea was to take on c4. Are you going to flinch at the puny little queen takes c6 threat, or are you going to do bishop takes c4 anyways, or are you going to defend your c6 pawn with something like rook c8, something like queen to c7 perhaps? And chat, what do you think here? What should be done? And maybe I just have to stop asking the chat room questions because YouTube is broken. All right, well, in this case, Magnus actually chooses correctly. In this case, if you do something like defend your c7 pawn very simply, the fact of the matter is white is going to be a little bit better after one really important consolidating move. What move is that? Well, it's the move g3. If white gets to play g3, and then even after you get this bishop off the board, your pawn structure is going to be a little bit worse. You just have a few too many weaknesses to keep track of. This knight, for the moment, isn't looking the happiest in the world. And once white finishes development with something simple like bishop e3, even something like bishop d2 to facilitate queenside castles, I think white is just going to be a little bit better. So Magnus senses the urgency in the position, and that is why he ends up with a good position here. Always be on the lookout to tell if your position is in danger of becoming worse. It's good to stop and evaluate who has the long-term advantages and who has the short-term advantages. In this case, It's black with the extra pressure on the h4 pawn and a short-term advantage. If in the long term, white is able to consolidate with the move g3, then it's actually going to be white with a little bit of an edge. Notably, even in this position, I think Geary's best move would have been g3. Why didn't he play g3? Well, he was probably worried that the position would be simplified a bit too much if black trades the queens, and perhaps this is true as well. That being said, I think this would have been pretty good for white with, at least a small advantage to continue pushing after knight takes d1. But instead, queen f3, the more active try, and Magnus, accepts the challenge, takes on c4. Geary now takes on c6, and we get king f8 and d takes c4. So what was Magnus's idea? Well, now that this queen has left the attack of this h-pawn, we can in fact capture on h4. Earlier, this would have been a big mistake. If we try to do this here, well, okay, first of all, this is hanging a piece. So if we tried to do this here, then once again, g3 would have been the response, and thanks to this queen's pressure, white is going to be better after rook takes h5. However, in the game, by drawing this queen to c6, Magnus realized that this was actually a pretty bad square for the queen in more ways than one. Number one, of course, it's not defending h5, but number two, this is actually just a vulnerable square. The queen is a little bit liable to getting attacked here. So we get d takes c4 and knight takes h4. Now, Geary plays what is probably the beginning of the end. This next move is what gives the advantage over to Magnus, and then Magnus quickly compounds that advantage and wins the game in short order. And that move is kingside castles, and I just think this is a pretty bad move. Geary's idea was probably to rapidly take control over this d file and use it to pressure the black king, but of course it comes at the risk of putting your own king sort of in the line of fire. You've given up this h-pawn, black already has this pawn on h5, and it's going to be a dangerous home for the white king over here. Magnus continues with knight f5, and now we see again the vulnerability of this queen on c6. Knight d4 is coming with tempo and attacking many things at the same time. There's f5 ideas after queen e4. It's going to be a little bit awkward for white to keep everything together. Because of that, Geary chose knight to e2, and now Magnus is very, very firmly in control here. Knight e2 stops knight d4, but now we see this queen get attacked once again with rook c8. And by the way, I still think queen e4 would have been the better option, but Geary sort of goes full greedy pawn grubber here and plays queen a4, going after the a7 pawn. So Geary has made a couple mistakes in this game. Number one, he puts his king in the line of fire, and then number two, he puts his queen on the opposite side of the board where it is cut off from returning to the action. And whenever that happens, you should have one thing on your mind, and of course that thing is checkmate. So how do you actually play for checkmate here? Well, there are some ideas that should be pretty natural to you, which involves pushing these pawns up the board. But then how do you get the heavy hitter into the game? How do you get this queen over to the king side? That is the brilliant idea that allowed Magnus to win this game so quickly. So, chat room. I guess I'm still going to ask you. Maybe I won't ask the chat room. I don't think there's too many people left with the YouTube difficulties. But how do you get this queen into the action? Go ahead, pause the video at home if you want to try to figure it out for yourself. The idea is actually to do it along not the dark squares, because white is able to guard these with bishop f4, but actually along the light squares with an idea such as queen a8. How do you make that happen? Well, Magnus uses dual-purpose moves, getting the queen into the action and at the same time slowing down white's play on the d file, and that dual-purpose move is rook c7. What's the point? The point is after bishop f4, rook d7, and Magnus is stopping rook d1, defending this a-pawn as well, and has cleared the way for the queen to enter the action. Now c3 by whites, and black to move and have a winning advantage. c3, of course, is an attempt to get rook d1 back on the table, but it is too slow at this point. So of course, the way to continue is with g5, gaining time on this bishop, and now Giri's position is sort of approaching hopeless here. He put this bishop in the line of fire, and it's only going to accelerate Black's attack from here on out. We see rook a d1 by Giri. This is now a threat, so rook takes d1, rook takes d1, and then the brilliant queen a8. Black is now attacking the white king from about as far away as you can be on the a8 square, and white is sort of helpless to put anything in the way. Bishop c7 was Giri's choice, but now simply h4. And now it looks like Giri sort of is giving up the game without a fight, but the fact of the matter is it's very, very difficult to play a move here with white, and in fact, you know, I would go as far as to say impossible. So what is Magnus threatening here? Well, Magnus is threatening, let's say you do nothing, threatening to play h3. Why is this move such a big deal? Well, this is a checkmate threat, and if you take here, then the simple rook takes h3, and queen h1 is going to be unstoppable. You just can't stop this queen from coming into the action here. If king f1, then rook h1, for example, and queen e4. Again, difficult to suggest moves here for white, as everything is going to be winning. So, to my eyes at least, I wondered, why doesn't Giri try the defensive-looking rook to d3? And the answer is, Magnus is still checkmating by force here. It is just such dominance on the light squares around white's king that there's simply no defense. Magnus would still be able to push h3, and after the seemingly defending rook takes h3, getting the major piece off the board, rook h3, pawn h3, now black to move and win. Of course, knight h4 is just an unstoppable attack here. Just devastating attack. Queen g2 check is impossible to stop. If you go king f1, trying to run, you can run for a little bit, but your run is quickly cut short by some nastiness over here. Some nastiness, some very nasty nastiness. All right, I'm not going to play any more moves. I hope you get the point by now. So what did Giri try? Well, he tried the move f3, but still this move h3 comes through, and Giri had had enough after h3 and resigned the game on move 23. Pretty devastating victory for Giri, and a very impressive win by Magnus Carlsen, recognizing the urgency in the position, allowing queen takes c6 with check, and then pushing for the victory while limiting counterplay. What more could you ask for in a 23-move chess game? All right, well, those of you still with us, any questions on this game before we move on? All right, then, let us move on. The next player I want to cover, which, by the way, these I think are the top 3 chess players in all of history, as I mentioned at the top of the hour. We've seen a game by Bobby Fischer. We've seen a game by Magnus Carlsen. Who's left? Well, you probably guessed it. The one, the only, Garry Kasparov has plenty of miniatures to his name. Of course, he probably has the most wild attacking reputation of any of those 3 players. And in this case, we're going to take another look at a game with the black pieces. Garry had black against Alexander Morozevich. And let's see what happened here. We once again are going to look at another e4 game, but this time we get the rather more timid e5. Garry meeting e4 with e5. No crazy Sicilian wins, no crazy Caro-Kann traps, just good old-fashioned e4, e5. That is until you see Morozevich's next move, which is f4. And so now, of course, we are in for a fairly wild and crazy game. Garry captures on f4 with the e-pawn, and we get knight f3, which is the main move. And then, rather than the main line with g5, Garry Kasparov chose the line with d6, which is also quite common, borderline the main line, I think. And here, Morozevich decides to take over the center with d4, very natural stuff. We get g5 by Garry, h4 by Morozevich, g4 by Garry. And here, the theory goes, knight back to g1, and something like bishop out to h6, queen out to f6, both of these moves aimed at defending the f-pawn, or something more active like f5 or knight f6, going after the e-pawn. However, in this case, Morozevich plays the move knight g5, not with the idea of retreating, but with the idea of taking this f-pawn off the board in true King's Gambit style. So Gary is not one to shy away from a challenge here, and chose the move h6. Now, if you ever, have the misfortune to find yourself facing this yourself, I would recommend this move f6 instead. I think it's a bit simpler for black to deal with than the lines after h6. This is still going to be a piece sacrifice, as this knight is totally trapped, but it's a sacrifice that's a bit easier to hold on to after bishop f4, fg5, and then either bishop or pawn takes, and your king does not get drawn out to the f7 square. Instead, Gary chose h6 when after knight takes f7, king takes f7, and bishop takes f4. Gary now has one piece developed, and that piece is his king. So the question is, how do you go about trying to consolidate a position like this? There are plenty of openings in chess that wind up with some crazy sacrifice like this. Most of them are very, very good for black. Some of them are winning for white because black has messed up somewhere along the way. But if you ever do find yourself in a position like this, against an opponent willing to play some dubious sacrifices against you, how do you actually go about consolidating? How do you go about developing your pieces, finding safety for your king? And the best answer to that question, I think, is to just start calculating, which sounds kind of obvious. But more than that, you want to look specifically at your opponent's threats and at your opponent's best placed pieces. So here, Gary plays the move bishop g7, which I think is a good move, but I think may not be the most accurate move in the position for defending. So looking at this position, the number one move that would strike my eyes with the white pieces is bishop c4 check. So, of course, I am going to think along the lines, how do I actually stop bishop c4? And I think I would want to play the move bishop e6. White can still get a lot of compensation for the piece by just developing normally with bishop d3, but then transposing to what Gary played with bishop g7, I do think this is going to be a little bit of a better version for black than what we saw in the game. If d5, kicking this bishop, I'm happy to retreat, safe in the knowledge that bishop c4 check is not going to happen to me anytime soon. Just for example, the game might continue, kingside castles, knight f6, blocking any discovered checks, e5 trying to open things up, takes, rook e8, and now it's sort of anyone's guess as to what is going on here, although of course black is keeping the extra piece. So I think maybe bishop e6 would have been good, and I didn't do too much of a deep dive into it, but optically I think this is a better practical move for black, just because it sort of hinders what white was looking to do with this bishop c4 check idea. Instead though, we get bishop g7, and white does in fact play this move bishop c4 check. Now Gary has to make a decision. Do you come up the board or down the board? And this is also a fairly difficult decision to make with the black pieces. Of course, your first instinct is probably to retreat the king like a sane person, but king g6 is not without merit as well. The point being, you just get off this back rank and have a little bit more space around your king. You're looking to sort of retreat back into an h7 hidey hole, but in this case, I do believe king e8 is the right choice. Why is that? Well, after king g6, there's a very impressive move for white here, and that move, of course, is e5. Just ripping things open, this diagonal opens up, and this king is going to find itself in some hot water. So king e8 is Kasparov's choice, and I agree with this one. Then Morozevich kingside castles, and I think this is what throws away the advantage and gives black the upper hand, sort of similar to what we saw in the Magnus Carlsen game. So what's going on after kingside castles? Well, Gary decides he's in fact not so interested in staying on the back foot for the remainder of the game and starts counterattacking. So why is kingside castles a bad move? Well, I think first and foremost, the main issue here is that it demands a response to any attack to the d4 pawn. With the king on e1, maybe white can actually sacrifice this pawn in some instances, but with the king on g1, it's going to be very difficult because bishop takes d4 is going to come with a check to the white king. And Gary continues just like that with knight c6. Now white already starts moving backwards with bishop e3, and after queen takes h4, seemingly out of nowhere, it is black who is attacking white and has an extra piece as well. So what would have been better? Well, I think better than castles is the developing move knight c3. And I did a little bit of analysis in this position, and I found it to be quite interesting. I think white may actually be close to winning in this position, which is sort of not what I would expect at first glance. You know, obviously white has some compensation for the piece, but I wouldn't expect white to actually be close to winning. And what's the point of knight c3? Well, the point is basically just that it gets the knight in the game, and it's not putting the king on g1. If black continues as in the game, and as I think he should with knight c6, going after the d4 pawn, now white is willing to sacrifice this pawn with queen d3, and the tempting bishop takes d4 is a move away from completely consolidating. Sadly, though, it will remain a move away. If white plays something slow, like queenside castles, then black is going to be doing great. After bishop e5, black gets this nice little blockader, can continue with something like knight e7, and will likely be in the game. However, white has the stunning move e5 here, and this is what rips open everything by force and is going to lead to an advantage for white. For example, if you continue with knight g e7, now e takes d6, c takes d6, queenside castles, and with the open e file, it's very much a different story compared to what we just looked at. Although, you know, the result is still very much going to be up in the air. It's still anyone's game, but this looks optically very dangerous for black. So I think knight c3 is a much better move than kingside castles. Even a move like queen d3 I think is better. Anything that doesn't put this king on g1, because the king on g1 makes white lose time, and time is the one thing white cannot afford to lose in this position. But kingside castle's in the game, knight c6, now it's too late to go for things like this, because again, bishop takes d4 check is going to just be very, very strong. In fact, it's close to checkmating. If you move the king, look out, you are in trouble. So white has to defend this pawn, and now queen takes h4, and Gary is just cruising here. That being said, rook f7 by white, and Gary comes up with a nice defensive move. Rook h7, you know, the bishop's attacked, might as well defend it, right? Rook h8 to h7, not the most common defensive move, but a good one in this case. White was not ready to throw in the towel, though, and continue with the move e5. This is the attacking idea that we've seen before, and it makes sense here as well. And now it is black to move and win the game. So I want to turn it to you guys at home, those of you who are with me, and those of you watching the replay, go ahead and pause the video here to try and figure out what black should do to win the game. There are many moves in the position, but I do like what Gary did in the game sort of the best here. So black to move. So Pippinchuk says g3, and g3 is definitely going to be a key idea, but it is not going to win the game in this case. If you play g3, you are actually very much in danger of losing the game. That's right, white has a winning idea in this position, and it goes in junction with this move e5. So what can white do here? White can play queen d3, and then all of a sudden you are running out of ways to defend this rook on h7, and if this rook moves, you're running out of ways to defend this bishop on g7. Queen h2 is a check, but nothing more. If you check me again, I can block. Queen h5, for example, and okay, well that would be a mistake, but knight c3 defending this way, and your problems aren't going away on h7. So g3, not a good move. Not a good move. Sacking the rook for the attack? What attack? There's no attack unless... okay, there's just no attack with only these two pieces, if white has all these defenders around the king, right? King f1, bishop g1, and your attack ends. So what can you do? Yeah, Pipinchuk is not interested in winning objectively. It's all about the psychological war, and bishop takes e5 is psychological dominance, according to Pipinchuk. And fair enough, it is a very appealing move, and it is, in fact, going to be slightly better for black after some moves here. Queen h2 check. King f1 is bad because this is coming after queen h1, but king f2 keeps the game going. Check here, takes. And it's true, black is doing pretty well in this position. But black has much better. So after e5, what does Garry Kasparov play? Well, he just attacks this bishop on c4. He says, yeah, if you go after my rook, I am coming after your rook, and that's that. So now queen d3, of course, is going to be met by knight takes c4, and this is going to be met by king takes f7. For the second time in the game, Garry is going to draw the king back out to f7 to capture a piece. In the game, we saw bishop d3 by Morozevich, but this still runs into king takes f7, and now after check, king e7 this time, takes on h7, and the simple developing move, bishop e6, is going to be close to the end of the game here. Black is now almost fully developed with this rook coming to f8. The king has found some safety, and black is just up a full piece here. Knight d2 played, rook f8, takes on d6 with check, takes queen e2, and then the simple king d8, stepping off the file. There's really nothing left to play for white. c3 was Morozevich's choice, but now knight e7, and black is literally fully developed. Rook e1 in the game, bishop out to c4 is the nice finishing tactic. With this queen now essentially trapped on e2, you cannot take twice because this piece will be falling. In fact, even if you take once, then I think still g3 is going to be crushing here. So bishop f5, bishop f2 in the game, then rook takes f2 is the nice sacrifice, and queen f2, g3, white resigns. Now, Garry is, of course, defending the escape route for the king, and queen h2 with mate is coming. So very impressive game by Garry Kasparov here, and even more impressive when you realize that it was, in fact, a rapid game. So Garry, fearless Garry Kasparov, takes on f7 with the king, and manages to defend in a rapid game. No easy task. By the way, I want to mention that up until the very end here, at the very ends, of course, we see this nice little sacrifice, rook takes f2. Up until that point, Garry captured all of his opponent's pieces with his king. All right, that's not something many people can say. He's taken a knight and a rook with his king on the f7 square and lived to tell the tale. All he does, capture pieces with his king. Pretty impressive stuff. Okay, so any questions on this game? And then, since we do have a little bit of time, I am going to show you a fourth game from a fourth player, nearly as good as these first three that we looked at. Nearly as good. Just goes to show the king is immortal. Not quite. Not quite, especially if you're playing with the white pieces here. All right, well, let's move on to one more miniature, and this time it's not Bobby Fischer, it's not Magnus Carlsen, it's not Garry Kasparov, it's yours truly, it's Caleb Denby with a miniature. I had a wonderful game actually earlier this year, probably the last wonderful game I am playing over the board for some time, against a St. Louis player by the name of Alex Zhang. And so I wanted to highlight this one as well. Again, somehow it's going to be our third miniature with the black pieces that I had against Alex. And we've only got a few minutes left, so let's take a look at it. Alex started with d4. I go knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, knight c3. So White has avoided the Nimzo Indian by playing this move knight f3 first, and then after d5, knight c3, I play the move bishop b4, no longer a Nimzo Indian because this move and this move are inserted, but in fact just a Rogozin defense. And there are many lines in the Rogozin, some are sort of simpler than others, but Alex chose the tempting option of queen a4 check. Why is this option so tempting? Well, it of course forks king and bishop and forces the move knight c6 to stop both threats. Why is this so desirable for white? Well, oftentimes in queen's pawn openings, it is very, very good to develop the knight behind the pawn. For example, white develops this knight behind the c-pawn, and due to that, is able to apply a lot of pressure to both of these squares. These two pieces just work well together. And from the black side, it can be favorable to play something like c6 to defend the d5 pawn, or actually a move like c5 to pressure white's center as well. And so by forcing knight c6, white is sort of making black's pieces look less than ideal in some cases. Bishop g5 is how my opponent continued, and I play the move h6, asking my opponent to make a decision with this bishop. And now, combined with queen a4, bishop g5, after h6, this should really be met with the move bishop takes f6. Why is that? Well, you've actually wasted a little bit of time to play this move queen a4. You brought your queen out to the side of the board, removing it from the center of the board where it is actually being useful to guard the center, guard the d4 square. So this move is sort of developing my knight for free, right? That's the downside to queen a4. So after bishop g5, you'd sort of better believe that you can't be wasting any more time with your pieces. And my opponent played bishop f4, which is, in this case, just going to be a little bit too slow. It gives black a little bit too much time in the opening. Much better is bishop takes f6. This is just a main line. Queen takes f6, and then e3, when white is going to finish development comfortably. But bishop f4 instead is my opponent's choice. I insert the move bishop d7, which, by the way, if you've ever played the Rogozin before, you probably know this one little tactic that often appears, and it's the tactic of bishop d7, right? It's tempting for white to just play a move like e3, claiming that with any discovery, your bishop is going to be hanging, but black to move and win here is, of course, the move knight takes d4. When you're in for a rude awakening with knight c2 check, forking king and queen. Now, it wouldn't be too impressive if I won in this manner, and my opponent did see this move and played the move queen c2, just retreating the queen. So now we see 1, 2, 3 wasted moves by white, and that is just a few too many. That's just a few too many. So, chat room, and those of you at home, black to move here. How should black continue in this position? You get the feeling that your opponent is just wasting so much time. There has to be something good for you. But what is it? What should you do here? What to play? Arthur asks, is this the Manhattan variation? And I actually don't know the specific name of it. I just know it as the queen a4 line. And Pippenchuk actually does have the right idea here. You want to soften up white's control of d4, and the way to do that is to make use of this h6 pawn and go g5. This is it. Now, you're not immediately actually winning d4. You would be if this bishop comes back to g3, when now all of a sudden this knight has nowhere to go, and knight takes d4 is going to be coming. But instead, bishop e5 does hold on to things for a little bit. That being said, g4 is still going to be the idea. Knight back to d2. And now, once again, black to move and press for the advantage. How do you keep things flowing? You shook up the white pieces before they finished developing, but now how do you continue? How to continue here? What to do? So as we are a bit low on time, and actually no, I don't just have to reveal the answer because Arthur in the chat does have it. You need to open things up When you're ahead in development, when you're pressing, you want to open the center, open things up, and the way to do that here is with the move knight takes e5. Pawn takes e5, and then you continue pressing with the move d4, and this is what gives black the advantage in this case. If you take on f6, don't even think about it, I am taking here, and after pawn takes, I'm not retreating, I'm taking on f6, and you are pinned up into the next century, basically. There's no way out of this stuff here. Queen e4, queen e5 is available if knight e4, and no time to develop this piece. f5 is coming, and this is just disaster. Disaster, disaster, disaster. So my opponent kept the game going, played the move knight d1, and then I just continue with knight h5, looking to attack some of these squares as well. My opponent continues with e3, a very natural move, trying to keep the knight out of f4 and develop this piece. But now, after bishop c6, it's going to be difficult for white to actually achieve these developing goals. The bishops are active. This knight, while for the moment sidelined, is always in dangerous position to invade. And it's just a very tough position here for white. They tried the move a3, which is a good try, and just retreated back to bishop e7. Now b4 by white is an active try to get rid of this bishop, but unfortunately it's just not quite enough. I went bishop h4 in the game, applying some pressure here, and after b5, d takes e3, opening things up, hitting this knight. Knight takes e3, and now black to move. What can be done here? What to do? In fact, there is only one move for black, but it is going to be a good one here. It's the move queen to d4. This is the active idea that I think Alex missed in the game. What's the point? Well, if you save the rook, then queen takes e3, and queen takes f2. And when I played this move, I was feeling quite proud of myself. I was quite pleased with what I had done. I was like, queen d4, white can resign, but white could have actually saved the game here. Alex had the opportunity to only be a little bit worse, and he would have ruined my miniature with the surprisingly legal queenside castles. So it pays to know all of the rules to castling. You save the rook. It doesn't matter that the queen attacks this square. Castling is still legal with the king. And here, bishop takes f2 is the best I can do, and the game will continue here. It is going to be good for black, but the game would at least keep going. But in the game, b takes c6 was Alex's choice, and then I just captured the rook on a1, knight b1, queen takes e5, takes on b7, takes on e3, king d1, rook d8 check, knight d2, queen takes a3. And I think Alex actually did continue the game for a little bit, but for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to say the game ended on move 22, so I can claim it was a miniature. That's going to do it for tonight's lecture. Hopefully you enjoyed these 4 miniature games from 4 of the world's best chess players, or at least 3. I had a lot of fun going over these games. If you're watching live, stay tuned for the endgame class, which I think we are just going to do on YouTube. Hopefully these technical difficulties on YouTube's end do get resolved pretty soon. But it's going to be a fun one today for endgames. All right, that's it. Thank you all so much for watching this edition of The Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.